Good evening. Welcome to this British Academy event. My name is Desmond King. I'm a professor of American politics, and I'm going to host the third in our series in which we're talking to leading scholars of African American politics in the United States about the long history of racial inequality in the US, and particularly prompted by not only the Black Lives Matter movement, but also by the recent election. Parts 1 and 2 of this series, featuring respectively Professor Megan Ming Francis and Kianka Taylor, are available on the British Academy YouTube channel. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my guest for the third in this series, Professor Fredrick Harris from Columbia University. Fred is Professor of Political Science, Director of the Institute for the Research of African American Studies, and Dean for Social Sciences, all at Columbia University. His scholarship has ranged widely over politics, racial inequality, race and religion, and he's written extensive commentaries in such op-ed outlets as the Washington Post, New York Times, and the London Review of Books. His publications include several books, including Something Within, Religion and African American Political Activism, and The Price of the Ticket, to which I'll be referring as we proceed today. And the aim of this discussion is to draw on Fred's expertise and particularly his research, his scholarly research about civil rights in American history. Fred, welcome. Thank you very much.
Cindas Des, I really appreciate you doing this series because I think it's very important.
Thank you, Fred. So do we. So I want to go through some of your research, the scholarly work, and some of the op-eds you've written about social movements, and then come into the contemporary period and see if we can shed any light on the last week as well as the last 10 months. So to start with your first book, which was Something Within, Religion in African American Activism. This was a valuable study combining survey research with qualitative analysis about how religion was an important, well, not so much religion, I suppose, but organized religion was an important means for civil rights activism and mobilization in the 20th century. Could you say a little bit about the book and what you found and its continuing significance?
Yes, it's a book that came out of my dissertation research. It's a project that I look back at, and looking at the multi approaches was immensely important, particularly as political science as a discipline has become more quantified. I think I have a greater appreciation for using the tools of survey research, using the tools of ethnography to really explore the multi-dimensional aspects of religion and its impact on African American political activism. What I was pushing up against when I was writing the dissertation, as well as what became a book, was this sort of orthodox Marxist view about religion as an opiate of oppressed people. And I thought there was some interesting survey work that had been done in the 1960s, but it saw religion or measured religion in one way. And so what I explored through ethnography and survey research is that there are three types of resources that are important or have been important to African American political activism. The institutional, as you said, it was very important, for instance, that African Americans are mostly Protestant, and so they belong to institutions that are less hierarchical, which are organized around the congregation, and because of that, as opposed to a more hierarchical institution like the Catholic Church, lay people learn organizing skills that are transportable to political struggle. So that was one important finding I had. And the other is the psychological, the impact of a sense of how a sense of religiosity impacts a sense of self-empowerment, of what political scientists call political efficacy, which had a very powerful impact not only during the civil rights movement when people were engaged in very risky political endeavors, risking their lives. They called on or relied on their spirituality to give them the strength to push through. So you had the institutional, the psychological, and the cultural, which was very important. How religion was used as a symbol to provide meaning to political action. So it was these three things: the institutional, the psychological, and the symbolic, that provided a sort of three-prong, multi-dimensional explanation for why religion, and particularly Afro Protestantism, has been very important as a resource for African American political activism.
That's terrific. That's a terrific summary of a complex and deep book. So it's very helpful indeed. I should have said at the beginning, I'll just put in brackets here that Fred and I will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. And if you have any, please put them, submit them using the Q&A button on your dashboard. But back to Fred, to the book. Did I mean, you particularly looked at Chicago, and we'll come back to Chicago a lot. Did the religious community in Chicago, African American activists particularly, matter to the politicians that came, African American politicians that came to a lot of prominence in the 20th century?
A great deal. Not necessarily as ministers. I think ministers provided information for congregants. And Chicago is very much of a mixed history because of the sort of machine politics that existed in Chicago for much of the 20th century. There were ministers who were reform minded. There were ministers who were part of the machine, particularly Richard Daley, the first Richard Daley's political machine, which actually undermined reform efforts. And so the important part of the book, one of the things is that part of the sort of the critique that was leveraged in sort of the role of the Black church in politics was look almost exclusively at the behavior of religious leaders, which you can find evidence on both sides of reform, as in the case of people like Dr. Martin Luther King, who had difficulties when he came to Chicago. He was defeated by the Daley machine, as many of your listeners probably already know, in 1966 when he had his open housing campaign. And one reason he was defeated is that many of the local ministers did not open their churches to mobilize people in the community behind the effort. Mostly because they were afraid of Richard Daley. They were scared that perhaps they couldn't get work done on their churches. There's one prominent minister who was there who sided with Dr. King, who for many years his property was the church property couldn't get any work done because they couldn't get any approvals from City Hall to get work to do renovations. And so it was the use of sort of patronage, other forms of sanctions, in a way to keep not only religious leadership in line, but also secular leadership, representatives who found it difficulty, who were afraid to sort of bulk the Daley machine. And as you know, as I talk about in the book that I hope we get to, The Price of the Ticket, Barack Obama and the Rise and Decline of Black Politics, where I write about Chicago. Harold Washington was a very important figure, and the one reason why he was able to mobilize is that he pushed many of those ministers who were on the sidelines during the Daley years to follow the people, the grassroots efforts that were coming up against people who were not supportive of Harold Washington. But again, I want to go beyond the leadership because the
Yes.
leadership is only a part of it. It's the communication networks that existed, the social networks, the sort of social milieu that exists within institutions, separate from ministers, were very important in mobilizing in Chicago, as well as during the civil rights movement more generally, or even during the period of Reconstruction, which I also talk about.
It's a recurring theme in your work, I think. I'm going to come back
Yes,
to it, but the issue of political leaders in African American civil rights communities and the position of so-called ordinary members, but activists and protesters. That comment leads nicely into this paper, which my students always love when they read it, and I think it's terrific, which you published in a journal called Social Movement Studies,
studies.
sorry, in 2006. Called it's a great title. I'll just give the whole one. It takes a tragedy to arouse them, collective memory and collective action during the civil rights movement. And in this paper, you reconstruct historical public opinion and other material from the 1960s, from the mid 1960s. You find surveys that were conducted then to demonstrate what a decisive influence one particular event, the Emmett Till killing, had on subsequent political action and on collective memory. I hope I'm summarizing it accurately.
Yes.
And so, thanks. What you find, I think, that's so interesting is what things become memorialized and remembered by a
Mhm.
community, and then how they can act as a basis for collective action.
Right.
Is that
Right.
a fair summary? Yeah.
That's
And
a good summary. Thanks for
go in more
reminding
depth.
me. Yeah, thanks for reminding me for the date. It's 2006 because it seems so fresh given what we see
Yes.
in the emergence of social movements today. Sort of how an event can propel or be appropriated by political actors, and then be used to provide meaning to social movements. And so you're absolutely right. I'm always standing in between not just political science, but political science and history, and political science and sociology. And so in this book, I'm sorry, in this article rather, I look at some rare 1960 data that ask questions about reflective questions to respondents about, do you remember the Scottsboro case of the 1930s? Do
Mhm.
you remember the murder of Emmett Till, which happened in 1955? Little Rock, other very important historical events. They weren't quite historical because they were at least happened 10 years before, at least in my analysis, before the respondents were asked the question. And not to my surprise, because in narratives of the civil rights movement, activists will always go back and say, the murder of Emmett Till, 14-year-old Emmett Till, which happened in Money, Mississippi in 1955, was such an important event, more so than Dr. King and the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened from 1954 to 1955. And so what I did is I estimated the effects of those of people acknowledging those memories on political activism or their reporting of political activism in the 1960s, because it was a survey done in the 1960s, late 1960s. And of all the events, the most positive and enduring and significant one was the murder of Emmett Till. And so that got me to think about what is the relationship between events, memories, group memories, and collective action, because there's not really any sort of many theories, at least within political science, that connect collective memory or group memories with collective action. And what I came up with is this idea of social appropriation, which scholars of social movements is a theoretical lens they use to explain how events, people like Charles Tilly, for instance, was one of the theoreticians of this idea of social appropriation. How sort of insurgents, how political activists appropriate these events, apply meaning to them as a way to spur collective action. My addition to this theory is that something else also happens. What else happens is that the events themselves become a part of what I call the memory repertoire of social groups. So in the making of in the appropriation, we also have memory making that goes on. That these people are being commemorated. They're becoming sort of icons of a movement. Books are being written about them. Plays are being written about this. This is a case of Emmett Till. Um, Music is being written about them. Poetry is being written about them, and so becomes a part of the cultural repertoire that is sustained over time, depending on the strength of that marginalized community. So when another event comes, not only is that event appropriated, but insurgents tap into the cultural repertoire of those communities, and they sort of uplift these historic figures or these iconic figures in their political struggle. So the reason why I say, for instance, why I think I'm surprised that I wrote this in 2004
Yeah.
is that we see this now in the movements that are occurring before us now. How these figures keep occurring and reoccurring within
Yeah.
politics of struggle within Black communities.
That's yeah, and I want to take us to one of your papers. We'll come to the book Price of the Ticket in a minute, but
Okay.
this paper on the paper on the Emmett Till event and its effect on collective memory, I think is a lovely background to a very influential op-ed you wrote in the Washington Post after the horrible events in Ferguson in 2014, the killing of
Right.
Michael Brown, the killing by police of an African American man, as you note in the piece. This happens far too frequently, as we know now, even more so. And the piece is called "Will Ferguson Be a Moment or a Movement?" As in the Washington Post, you can find it if you Google for it. Um, and you place what then what was rapidly becoming Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, into historical context and ask whether it's going to sustain itself. And you're pretty optimistic at that time
Mhm.
about the question of whether it will lead to real change or not. And it's coming, of course, in the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, when the sort of forces of white protectionism and white nationalism are beginning to mobilize quite powerfully. We have the Trump leading his birther movement at this period, and a Republican Senate which has essentially stopped working with the Obama White House and not agreeing to any major legislation at that stage. If you can
Right.
remember that bit, can you just say a little bit about it, Fred, and what your sense was then about the movement?
Yeah. Actually, this is one of, despite it takes a tragedy to arouse them, which is in a academic journal, Social Movement Studies. And this is sort of my qualm with, not qualm, or I'm about to say it's a qualm with what I see as not enough of scholarly knowledge being used for public engagement. And so this was my attempt to sort of use the research that I had discovered in my work on the civil rights movement and discovering the impact of Emmett Till, sort of press the case that now is the time. When a moment became a movement, written weeks, not a week, maybe days after the murder uh, Michael
Michael
Brown,
Brown.
um, and and what I wanted to do is sort of advocate this position about why. I mean, I was in many ways becoming a social appropriator, um, by
Yeah,
sort of outlining the possibilities of social change because of this event. That this event was very critical. Now, keep in mind, as in the case of the Emmett Till case, that there were people who were killed. In this case, Eric Gardner had been killed weeks before in Staten Island. We know him famously from his last words of "I can't breathe," right?
yeah,
And then Michael Brown, and this sort of spurred reaction, mostly because, again, it's the image. So people sort of remember the image of Emmett Till because of his battered body, right? That in sort of black newspapers, black magazines, we could see the consequences, the physical consequences of white supremacist violence, through the beating and killing and torturing of Emmett Till. In the case of Michael Brown, it was the fact that his body laid in on a street in Ferguson, Missouri, in the hot Missouri sun for hours. Someone finally covered his body. And so it's that searing image, or and again, you know, the sort of the appropriation of this is on in real times, is not just black newspapers as it happened in the 1950s with Emmett Till, but in the case of in the 21st century, is social media, right? So if you can see, Michael Brown's body bleeding, throughout the world almost in real time, through Twitter, through Facebook, and other social media outlets. Um, and so, what I wanted to do is to say that this is possible. These are what activists did in the 1960s. The sort of the politics of respectability, or the blame shifting, that had Michael Brown been more had more respect for the police, or he may have had a criminal background, or Mike. So, what's important in this process of social appropriation by activists and people, primarily Black Twitter, that it's become known, is that they had the ability to shape the narrative. And this is what I was saying in that piece, that this time is different because the politics of respectability, saying, the blame is being shifted to the police, as it should be in this aggressive policing, rather than sort of whatever the individual faults that may have people who are victimized by the police. So I began to see this shift as well. But also, I talked about, as sort of activists in the 1950s during the Cold War, how they appealed to the United Nations, how they talked about sort of the genocidal behavior of the American state against Black people, that perhaps claimants in this instance should also go to international forums to talk about the human rights violations of African Americans in the United States, in a country that sees itself as the beacon of democracy. So, in many ways, again, I was being a social appropriator. I was sort of laying the ground for what a social movement would look like in terms of shaping the discourse and providing strategy and action, and a path to action, in the context of the movement.
That's really interesting. I think we should come back a little bit to the movement for Black Lives after we talk a
Hmm.
bit more about the book on Obama, just to keep our chronology
Hmm.
in order. But
Hmm.
I would underline the point you make about appealing to the UN, and also putting the context of civil rights reform in that Cold War era. The UN was unresponsive
Right.
previous periods, and but international sort of pressure did seem to make a slight difference in the 60s. But as you know, that's
Right.
something Scott talk about quite a lot. But I think it's well worth pointing out how about the internationalization that went on in that period. So, Fred, you published this book, The Price of the Ticket, several years into the Obama presidency, and it's become a very widely cited work and influential. And that's why, and it seems to be to hark back to the theme we talked about in respect to your first book about the constraints that fetter any African American politician who gets into national office or major office. I mean, we could think about some big city mayors as well, and governors across the U.S. There haven't been very many African American governors since in the 20th century. Those two arguably face similar constraints. And I suppose there's an argument too about what sort of agenda successful African American candidates have to take. And your colleague, Charles Hamilton at Columbia, who co-authored the famous book Black Power with Stokely Carmichael, in that book it's often characterized that they were arguing for a certain deracialization, or he wrote a paper about that later. It wasn't so much in Black, I should say, in the subsequent work. And you come in and you really focus on, I mean, the point of the title, it's a brilliant title again, The Price of the Ticket, is that the price is a certain sort of recognition of constraints and of limits about what can be discussed. And I think you particularly think that, like other commentators and scholars, that Obama had to avoid discussing certain issues of racism and discrimination because he thought that would erode a broader base, and that he perhaps didn't focus enough on the kinds of targeted reforms necessary to address pretty enduring and serious material racial inequality in the U.S. Is that a fair summary, or do you want to flesh it out a bit more?
Yeah, it's a fair summary. Many people mistakenly think that that it is a critique of Barack Obama himself, but the critique really is looking at the politics of Black communities, because, as you know, there are various chapters in the book that look at sort of political ideologies, and I'm never far in any of my research not discussing religion, for instance.
Yes.
So I talk about the prosperity gospel versus the social gospel or liberation theology tradition. Those tensions exist within Black communities and how they might have been informing their views of politics during the Obama era, right? In both cases, it's about transforming the individual rather than transforming communities, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
prosperity gospel is about, if you give to God, you're, financially, you're going to have riches and you're going to have good health, which is, how people think that they can transform their lives, rather than sort of Dr. King and what came later through the Black Power movement, liberation theology. It was about transforming communities in an unjust society. So the approaches of sort of thinking about Obama is evolving from these ideological fissures and changes within Black communities. And the argument really is about why Black communities didn't hold Obama far more accountable or pressure him as other constituencies did, LGBTQ community, pro-immigration communities, given the constraints that they were also facing with a hostile Congress or the emergence of a very strong counter right-wing movement in the country. They were able to make some policy successes, or they were able to push some policies through. For African Americans, they were more too, in my argument, too protective of the president, and because they saw him as a symbol of progress. And for many, it was far more important to have a black president and a black family in a White House than it was to push through their, to agitate on very important policy issues like criminal justice reform. And so that's sort of the meat of it. And the price of the ticket is assuming that both symbolic and the substantive are one and the same, which they are not.
Yeah.
Just because you have black representation does not necessarily mean, and this person is a symbol of the community, does not necessarily mean that there is going to be, or they even advocate substantial targeted policies for their communities.
Because the constraints are so significant, the institutional, the structural constraints, the political constraints. And ironically, or I don't know if it's ironically or just tragically, this lack of focus on structural issues nonetheless did not preclude the emergence of a very angry white
Exactly. Right.
who pushing themes of white protectionism, opposing civil rights, and so forth, and very high immigrant. And then he becomes president, Donald Trump, and he's just been defeated in an election where he acquired an additional 5 million votes compared to what he got in 2016. And as you know, I've
Right.
done work this with Roger Smith, looking at the rhetoric and the policy content of the last 4 years, where we find there's been what we call significant pushing back of civil rights agendas. And this has
Right.
been part of the package that has appealed to the American voters. What's your take on this? I mean, that's a big question, sorry, but I mean, what's your main reflection on what happened with Trump, what the appeal was, what the capacity was to expand this appeal to such a large part of the electorate?
So I have a different view. I don't know if it's different view. I don't know how different. There's this assumption. I mean, you've written about sort of the United States and not necessarily a beacon of democracy, but it also goes through a process of democratization. It's always, pushing for change. But when it comes to race and reform in the United States, Roger Smith has written about this idea of it's a steady march of progress, that, where we see during Reconstruction, there was substantial reform through 3 constitutional amendments, through acts, but the federal courts undermined that progress in combination with anti-Black vigilante violence through sort of the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations. So, and we see this occurring again at mid-century, 20th century, with the so-called Second Reconstruction. It's met also with a racial backlash. Then we have the case of the emergence of Barack Obama as the first person of African ancestry to become president of the United States, represented a threat to many white Americans, which also has led to a backlash. And so what I see is these, not so much this idea of a linear progress when it comes to race and reform, but actually I think we're in a vicious cycle. I think it's cyclical. I think we go through moments where there's robust reform followed by periods of backlash. In some cases, the backlashes differ in force. One can argue, for instance, that what happened in '68 with the emergence of Richard Nixon and the election of Reagan in 1980 may be a softer form of that backlash compared to sort of the collapse of Reconstruction, or maybe what we are experiencing and what I believe we will be experiencing for years to come. So if we look at it through that prism, sort of this idea that we're in a cycle, the emergence of Trump and sort of white supremacist ideas and views in this country should not be a surprise at all. And I'm not
Yes.
surprised. Perhaps I'm surprised by the fact that what is it, 50 a majority of white people in the United States supports a white supremacist president, a president who supports white supremacy, and have no problem doing it.
Yep.
um,
Yep.
and
Yep.
so and we're not in the late 19th century. We're in the 21st century. We supposed to have gotten past this. There was all this jubilation in 2008 about the election Barack Obama, that America has finally got past its racism, and that what we have, what, not even 10 years later, or around
Yeah.
that time, we have the emergence of Donald Trump. And I don't think it's an aberration. And I also think it's driven by other factors. I think the cyclical pattern that we're in, the forces underneath it, there's some things that are similar, and then there are other things that are not. I think what's driving it now is demographic change in the United States. And that's why we have a targeted immigration policy, particularly at the southern border, or sort of a targeting of Muslims, immigration to or people from Muslim countries, uh, their immigration to the United States. And I think the idea that by mid-century, this century, um, that it would be, quote, a majority minority country scares a lot of white people in the United States, and it's going to drive that politics. What this really reminds me of, in a reverse way, is basically in a micro or miniature sense, is the transition of a white supremacist controlled government in South Africa to a multiracial
Mhm.
democracy. There was a
Yep.
lot of violence that happened in between it. A lot of compromise. It was in sort of shorter order. But and the demographics are reverse. But I think the sort of dynamics, we could look at them as possibly similar to some degree. But the point is that they came with a lot of rancor. That transition came with a lot of rancor, and it came with a lot of violence.
I agree. That's a very good analysis. There are several questions coming in from audience members, and I'll just pass on a few while we have our last few minutes. One which picks up a theme I wanted to raise with you. It asks, what's the likely consequences of the George Floyd tragedy in the light of your analysis in It Takes a Tragedy? So I think that's probably a broader question about the movement for Black lives. And I'll tag on my question, which is that a lot of what I've read is emphasizing process and local politics as very important for the future, the extent to which there is an organized movement called the Movement for Black Lives, but there are local activists emphasizing process and participation. And then there's obviously the efforts of someone like Stacey Abrams, um, transforming a whole state, which may, I suppose, count as local in some ways. But which ways do you see things going in this latest iteration?
Yeah, I know. This is interesting. Like the work that I did in that piece, it takes a tragedy to arouse them. There are always events that are going to come up, right?
Yeah.
And so the most recent big event has been George Floyd, where people in that moment, the symbol, sort of the meaning attached to that was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This is the time where the foot of the police officer was on the neck of George Floyd, and he died, right? And so that memory, that image is seared in people's minds. Now, the conditions for rebellious behavior are quite different in 1955 than it would be now, or even the
Yeah.
1960s. COVID has a lot to do with it. I think the fact that people were bottled up into their homes, couldn't move about, that this event allow the country to focus its attention, because in many ways we were sort of, I want to say idle, but we were just, we weren't involved in our daily routine. And so the question now is, how enduring will that event be in substantial change? Not sure, because the country is divided, right? I think one important
Yeah.
consequence of this is that the Democratic Party has decided to get on board, with doing something around, criminal justice reform. We'll see what transpires. It would also come with its constraints. We talked about before, before we started, this session, about sort of the constraints there would be in the U.S. Senate, for instance, if it's not a majority, what can be done, what can't be done. Um, but the question around organization, you're absolutely right. We're seeing the effects of this, and this is the effects of movements that we often don't see. So there's gradual progress around the election of reform-minded prosecutors. Just
Mhm.
in LA, there was a progressive, prosecutor who was elected, against a woman who's, been far more, or an incumbent who's been far more supportive of the LA, police department. We saw that change in St. Louis, Chicago, Philadelphia, other cities where reform minded prosecutors who have commitment to, police reform, or holding police accountable, or not locking people up on minor nonviolent offenses. So we're seeing those changes, and also some progressive members of Congress are being elected in places like New York, or there was a defeat of a incumbent, in St. Louis, member of the Congressional Black Caucus, who people felt that he wasn't really responsive to issues around police reform, who was defeated by, a Black woman, an insurgent who's far more progressive, on these issues. And so on the local level, we are seeing changes, but I still think that there's a challenge here, and maybe this is because perhaps in the 21st century, social movements don't look like what they used to look like. And so to me, there seems to be a disjuncture between what I think is the importance of people expressing their frustrations through protests, and even through sort of, violent means, that can be sort of quite understandable given the deaths of sort of inhumane, events that have happened to sort of victims of the police, people like, in George Floyd, for instance, Ahmaud Arbery, who wasn't killed by the police, but in Brunswick, Georgia, Donna Taylor, an innocent victim in Louisville, Kentucky, a no-knock warrant by police, sort of killed her, and so one can understand sort of the responses, but there seems to be sort of a disjuncture between the protests, which leads to these issues becoming a part of the political agenda. But how is it connected to sort of legislative institutions? What kind of conversations are those levers being, hit by activists? Here again, we always go back to civil rights movement. Dr. King and others were negotiating as activists, were negotiating with LBJ around legislation, around the Civil Rights Act, around the Voting Rights Act. What's happening on the state levels? How are insurgents in places like Atlanta or St. Louis, are they trying to make change in their state legislatures, right? So the question is not just sort of the bottom up movement influencing national policy, but what's the connection between those protests and policy making and local legislative institutions? I think that's yet to be figured out and worked out in terms of the movement.
Thank you very much, Fred. I think we're going to have to finish here. There are other questions asking about the vice president-elect, which is a great question, and about the issue of mass incarceration and what sorts of protests are happening about that. But you've already referred a little bit to criminal justice reform. And so I'm sorry that we have to finish at this point, but this has been an absolutely fascinating and compelling account, Fred. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the audience. And questions can be followed up subsequently with emails and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you.